My name is Natalie Pierce, and I am 33 years old. For nearly 6 years, my ex-husband and his family described me, consistently, to anyone who would listen, as emotional, unstable. The kind of person whose word could not be entirely trusted regarding what had actually happened during our marriage, 3 weeks ago. During a hearing regarding modifications to our existing custody arrangement, I placed a single folder on the table in front of the judge, containing 217 pages of emails, text messages, and 3 separate written statements from people who had directly witnessed specific incidents I had been describing for years. The judge reviewed the folder for nearly 20 minutes before looking up. His expression, when he finally did, was not one I expect to forget anytime soon. Before I tell you what he said, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and the time where you are watching from. I read every single comment. Let me take you back to the year everything started, and the specific way this particular kind of doubt gets built. I married Gabriel Pierce 8 years ago, after dating for 2 years. A relationship that, during its earlier stages, felt genuinely happy, though I recognize now, with considerable hindsight, that certain patterns had already begun establishing themselves before we ever reached the altar. Gabriel came from a close, somewhat insular family, his mother Diane and his 2 sisters maintaining the kind of constant daily contact that, initially, struck me as simply a warm, tightly knit family dynamic, rather than anything more concerning. I did not fully understand, during our dating years, how thoroughly this family operated as a coordinated unit, how consistently they shared information among themselves, how readily they constructed shared narratives about people and situations outside their immediate circle. I began to understand this considerably more clearly during our 2nd year of marriage, when the first serious disagreement between Gabriel and me became, almost immediately, a topic of discussion among his entire extended family before I had even fully processed the disagreement myself. I want to walk through, specifically, how this dynamic typically operated, because understanding the actual mechanism matters considerably to understanding everything that eventually followed. Gabriel and I would have a disagreement, the kind of ordinary conflict that occurs in most marriages, about finances, about household responsibilities, about how we were each handling stress from work. Within days, sometimes within hours, I would notice subtle shifts in how his mother and sisters interacted with me, slightly cooler, slightly more guarded. The kind of change that suggested they had received some version of events that positioned me unfavorably without my having any opportunity to provide my own perspective. I learned, eventually, through occasional comments from Gabriel's sister Renata, who I maintained a somewhat more open relationship with than the rest of the family, that Gabriel routinely described our disagreements to his mother and sisters immediately after they occurred, consistently framing his own behavior favorably while characterizing my responses as disproportionate, as emotional, as evidence of some underlying instability that made my perspective on any given conflict inherently less reliable than his own. The specific language used, repeated consistently across years, settled into a particular pattern that I think reveals considerably more about the family's coordinated approach than any individual conflict ever could on its own. I was described, repeatedly, as someone who, quote, blew things out of proportion, as someone who, quote, remembered things differently than they actually happened, as someone whose, quote, emotional reactions made it difficult to have rational conversations about actual problems in the marriage. I want to be honest that experiencing this characterization repeatedly, across years, eventually produced a genuine, disorienting effect on my own confidence regarding my perception of events within my own marriage. I began increasingly second-guessing my own memory of specific incidents, wondering whether I was, in fact, perceiving things less accurately than Gabriel and his family consistently suggested I was. I did not yet understand, during most of this period, that this growing self-doubt represented precisely the intended effect of years of consistent, coordinated characterization. Regardless of whether that coordination was entirely deliberate or simply an emergent pattern within a tightly bonded family unit, the marriage began deteriorating more seriously roughly for years and, following an incident that I want to describe specifically, because it became, eventually, central to everything that occurred during our subsequent divorce and custody proceedings. Gabriel and I had a significant argument one evening regarding his repeated lateness picking up our daughter. Mia, then 3 years old, from daycare. A pattern that had resulted on several occasions. In the daycare, contacting me directly because Gabriel had simply failed to arrive within the facility's required pickup window. During this particular argument, Gabriel grabbed my arm forcefully enough to leave visible marks. An incident that occurred in our kitchen with no witnesses present beyond ourselves and partially Mia, who was in an adjacent room and may have heard raised voices without directly witnessing the physical contact itself. I did not call the police that evening. A decision I have, since then, processed considerably regarding whether it represented the right choice. I did, however, take photographs of the resulting marks the following morning, and I mentioned the incident, that same week, to my sister Vanessa and to a close friend, Priya, both of whom I described the specific details to at the time. While the incident remained genuinely fresh, this incident, when I eventually raised it directly with Gabriel's family during a subsequent conflict roughly a year later, was characterized, almost immediately, in ways that I think exemplify the broader pattern considerably more clearly than any other single incident from our marriage. Diane, Gabriel's mother, when I mentioned this incident directly during a tense family conversation, responded that she found it difficult to believe Gabriel would ever behave that way, that I had likely, quote, misremembered or exaggerated what had actually occurred during what she characterized as simply a heated argument that had probably involved mutual raised voices and mutual physical contact, rather than anything one-sided. Gabriel, present during this same conversation, did not directly deny the incident occurred, but did characterize it as considerably less serious than I was describing, suggesting I had grabbed his arm as well during the same exchange, a claim that, while I cannot definitively disprove every detail of what he experienced internally during that argument, did not match my own clear memory of an incident where I had been attempting, primarily, to simply move away from him rather than engaging in any reciprocal physical contact. I want to be specific about the photographs I had taken the morning after this incident, because they eventually became significant evidence during the divorce proceedings that followed several years later. I had taken 4 photographs that morning, clearly showing distinct bruising along my upper arm, photographs that I had saved at the time to a private cloud storage account that Gabriel did not have access to, alongside a brief written note documenting the date and a short description of what had occurred. I did not take this action at the time with any specific strategic intention regarding future legal proceedings. I took the photographs, if I am honest about my actual motivation in that moment, simply because some part of me already recognized, even then, that I might eventually need some form of objective documentation if my own account of what had happened continued being characterized as unreliable or exaggerated by Gabriel and his family. The marriage continued for approximately 2 more years following this incident. The underlying dynamic of consistent characterization and consistent self-doubt continuing largely unchanged, until Gabriel and I ultimately separated when Mia was 5, following several additional incidents that, individually, I will not detail exhaustively here, but that collectively confirmed, with increasing clarity, that the pattern I had been experiencing represented something genuinely concerning rather than simply my own unreliable perception of ordinary marital conflict. I filed for divorce shortly after our separation, a process that almost immediately surfaced the exact dynamic that had characterized our entire marriage, now applied directly to formal legal proceedings rather than simply informal family conversation. Gabriel's initial filing characterized me, through his attorney, in language that closely mirrored years of family characterization, suggesting I had a, quote, pattern of emotional volatility that raised genuine concerns regarding my capacity to provide a stable, consistent environment for Mia. I want to walk through specifically how I began building my actual response to this characterization, because the process took considerably longer and required considerably more methodical effort than I had initially anticipated. When the divorce proceedings first began, I consulted a family law attorney, a careful, experienced woman named Christina Barra, who explained, during our initial consultation, that successfully countering a sustained, years-long narrative of emotional instability would require something more substantial than simply my own verbal denial. However genuine and however accurate that denial actually was, She advised me to begin systematically gathering any documentation that existed corroborating specific incidents I had previously described, including the photographs from the kitchen incident, any text messages or emails where Gabriel had, at the time, acknowledged specific behaviors he later minimized or denied, and any witnesses who could provide direct, contemporaneous corroboration of specific events, rather than simply general character testimony about my overall reliability. This process, which ultimately took nearly 8 months to complete thoroughly, required me to revisit, systematically, nearly 6 years of accumulated incidents, separating genuine, documentable evidence from incidents that, while genuinely experienced, lacked sufficient contemporaneous documentation to present as formal evidence within legal proceedings. I contacted Vanessa and Priya directly, both of whom agreed to provide written statements describing, specifically, what I had told them at the time regarding the kitchen incident and several subsequent incidents I had described to them as they occurred. Statements that, Christine explained, would carry considerably more legal weight, specifically, because they documented contemporaneous disclosure rather than simply current recollection constructed after the fact for the purposes of litigation. I located, through a careful review of old text message archives, several specific exchanges where Gabriel had, at the time of various incidents, acknowledged behaviors he later, during family conversations and eventually during the divorce proceedings themselves, characterized considerably differently or denied having occurred at all. I want to be specific about the daycare incident as well, because it became, eventually, a particularly significant piece of corroborating evidence, given its origin from an entirely independent third party, with no personal stake in our marital dynamics whatsoever. I contacted the daycare facility directly, requesting any records they maintained regarding the specific incidents of Gabriel's repeated late pickups, discovering that the facility maintained detailed sign-in and sign-out logs, along with internal notes documenting specific incidents when they had needed to contact me directly because Gabriel had failed to arrive within the required pickup window. These records, spanning roughly 14 months before our separation, documented 11 separate occasions where Gabriel had been more than 30 minutes late for scheduled pickup, with the facility's own internal notes, specifically documenting their attempts to reach him directly before ultimately contacting me as the secondary emergency contact. This documentation directly corroborated a specific pattern I had described repeatedly throughout our marriage and throughout the early divorce proceedings, a pattern that Gabriel had consistently characterized as exaggerated or occurring considerably less frequently than I was suggesting. By the time Christine and I had completed this comprehensive documentation process, we had assembled a folder containing 217 pages of material, including the original photographs from the kitchen incident, written statements from Vanessa and Priya documenting contemporaneous disclosure of multiple specific incidents, the daycare's independent records corroborating the pattern of late pickups, and a chronological compilation of relevant text message exchanges where Gabriel had, at various points, acknowledged specific behaviors he later minimized or denied. Christine explained, as we prepared for the formal custody modification hearing, that this comprehensive documentation served a purpose considerably beyond simply proving any single incident had occurred. It established, through multiple independent sources spanning the entire duration of our marriage, a consistent, corroborated pattern that directly contradicted the characterization of me as emotionally unreliable or prone to exaggeration that Gabriel and his family had maintained consistently for nearly 6 years. The custody modification hearing occurred 3 weeks ago, addressing Gabriel's request to modify our existing arrangement to grant him primary physical custody, based largely on continued characterization of me as emotionally unstable and therefore less capable of providing consistent, reliable care for Mia. Christine presented our case methodically, establishing context before introducing the comprehensive documentation we had assembled, requesting the judge's permission to submit the complete folder for direct review rather than simply summarizing its contents verbally. The judge granted this request, taking the folder and reviewing its contents directly, methodically working through each section, the photographs, the written statements, the daycare records, the text message compilation, for nearly 20 minutes while the courtroom remained largely silent. both attorneys and both parties waiting for him to complete his review. I watched the judge's expression shift gradually as he continued working through the material. The careful, neutral expression he had maintained throughout the earlier portions of the hearing slowly giving way to something considerably more focused, more serious, as the cumulative scope of what he was reviewing became increasingly clear. When he finally looked up, completing his review, his first comment, addressed directly to Gabriel's attorney, was considerably more pointed than I had anticipated. He noted specifically that the documentation before him represented a considerably more substantial and considerably more corroborated record than the characterization presented in the original custody modification petition had suggested existed, and he asked directly whether Gabriel's attorney wished to address any specific items within the documentation before proceeding further. Gabriel's attorney requested a brief recess, a request the judge granted, providing both parties 15 minutes before resuming. During that recess, Christine told me quietly that judges generally do not comment so directly on the substance of submitted documentation before formally ruling, and that his specific comment suggested the comprehensive nature of what we had presented had genuinely shifted his initial assessment of the case considerably more than typical evidence submissions usually managed to achieve. When proceedings resumed, Gabriel's attorney indicated they wished to revise certain elements of the original petition, no longer pursuing the request for primary physical custody, instead proposing modifications to the existing arrangement that, while still requesting some adjustments to the current schedule, no longer rested explicitly on characterizing me as emotionally unreliable or unstable. The judge ultimately ruled, several weeks later, maintaining our existing custody arrangement with only minor scheduling adjustments, explicitly noting, in his written decision, that the petitioner's original characterization of the respondent's reliability had not been adequately supported by the evidence presented, while the respondent's documentation had provided considerable, multiply corroborated support for her own account of relevant events throughout the marriage. I think often about the nearly 6 years during which I gradually internalized a characterization of myself that I now understand clearly reflected considerably more about a coordinated family narrative than about any genuine instability or unreliability on my own part. I think, too, about how methodical and how time-consuming the process eventually required to definitively counter that narrative actually was. Nearly 8 months of careful documentation, multiple independent sources, a process that, while ultimately successful, represented a kind of exhausting labor that should never have been necessary. In the first place, had the original characterization simply not been constructed and sustained so consistently across so many years, my relationship with Gabriel's extended family has remained, since the hearing, essentially non-existent, a development that, while not entirely surprising given everything that occurred, still represents a genuine loss, given the years I had previously invested in attempting to maintain functional relationships with people who had, ultimately, consistently characterized me unfavorably without ever directly engaging with the actual substance of what I was describing. Gabriel and I maintain a considerably more functional, co-parenting relationship now than existed during the years immediately preceding our divorce. Though I recognize this improvement likely reflects, at least partially, the simple fact that the formal documentation process eliminated whatever continued advantage he might have hoped to gain by maintaining the previous characterization within an active legal proceeding. Mia, now 7, remains largely unaware of the specific legal proceedings that occurred regarding her custody arrangement, a separation I have worked deliberately to maintain. Believing that the details of this particular conflict between her parents represent something she does not need to navigate at her current age, I think sometimes about how close that entire process came to producing a considerably different outcome. Had I not happened to take those initial photographs 6 years ago, had Vanessa and Priya not maintained sufficiently clear memories of conversations from years earlier, had the daycare not maintained the kind of detailed records that ultimately corroborated a pattern I had been describing, largely unsuccessfully, for years, I am genuinely grateful, looking back, for whatever combination of instinct and circumstance led me to begin documenting things, gradually, years before I fully understood how significantly that documentation would eventually matter. That is my story. If you have ever had your own account of events consistently dismissed or characterized as unreliable, only to eventually find the evidence that definitively confirmed what you had been saying all along, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments, and if this story reminded you that consistent documentation can sometimes matter more than any verbal account, however genuine and however accurate that account actually is, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. I will see you in the next one.